that gets into one of the big cognitive biases, which is automation bias. And we haven't talked about automation bias. Back in 2012, one of the first Wall Street trading firms to turn their account, their portfolio entirely over to an AI was Knight Capital. And they almost went bankrupt after their algorithm made $440 million in bad trades in just 45 minutes. And you think to yourself, if we're going to be pioneers in this area, if we're going to turn our portfolio over to a machine, probably we should be looking over its shoulder for a few months to make sure it knows what it's doing. You'd think. But no, they didn't. And the reason why is simple. It's automation bias. People tend to trust machines and the recommendations that they get from machines more than they trust their own eyes, more than they trust themselves, more than they trust other people. And, in some cases, I understand why, because, people are more prone to cognitive biases than machines are, but machines are also not error free. And we have partly, there's a lot of cultural and historical reasons for this, but we have reached the point where we tend to become so reliant on machines and on the data and indicators that they provide that we will believe it over our own eyes. So that an interesting way that they've studied this is by looking at professional pilots. And they found that in simulators, when they simulated machine malfunctions, and I don't mean mechanical malfunctions, I mean data malfunctions on the cockpit instrument panels, they found that more than half of pilots either disregarded important information when automated systems failed to alert them to it, or even worse, made a dangerous mistake based on the erroneous information that they were given. And we've seen that happen not just in simulators, but unfortunately, tragically, in the real world too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember there was an Air France crash, I think, that was coming out of Rio back in late 2000s. And it crashed into the Atlantic, if you remember. And everyone's like, absolutely unheard of. And I think when they got the voice recorder out, the aircraft was in a stall position. And the autopilot was telling them, stall, stall, stall. And because the pilots and engineer convinced themselves it couldn't be doing that, they ignored it. And the aircraft stalled and crashed into the ocean. And the cockpit was the voices of the crew all disagreeing with each other because they were in a state of confusion rather than trusting the time that the aircraft was stalling and they should have taken over. They didn't, and the opposite happened.
That was Air France 447, and it crashed in 2009, I believe. And it was flying through a thunderstorm over the Atlantic, and the sensors on the wings, the
pitos,
the pitos froze. They got iced over, and so they weren't functioning. And they as you said, the cockpit recorder said that the computer was saying pull up, pull up, pull up, and yet they could hear on the cockpit audio the entire cockpit shaking as the plane was stalling. And the point that the investigators made was that a Cessna pilot on their second solo flight should know that if the plane's bucking like that, it means that you're stalling, and the worst thing in the world you could do is pull up. And yet they did, because the machine told them to pull up, and hundreds of people died because of that. And that's not the only one. I mean, there's been several plane crashes that are attributed to automation bias, and not just recently. I mean, going back to one of the first ones was Eastern Airlines 401 in 1972. Where they got faulty indicators too, and that led to a crash. There's been several since then. And it's, this is a dangerous tendency for us to not check what we get from machines. And I know that when I was researching my book, Red Teaming, and I was looking into some of these studies that the FAA and NASA had conducted into why pilots do this, they found that there was a series of experiments they did where there was a a indicator light that came on in the simulator showing that they had an engine failure. And on whatever the plane that they were using for these experiments, in addition to the idiot lights that just come on and say you have an engine failure, you can look at the engine operational metrics. You could see the RPMs and stuff like this. If they had looked at the gauges, it was clear the engines were working fine. But in over half the cases, they assumed they had an engine failure because the light was blinking and saying they had an engine failure.
This goes exactly, I think, to where we are today. You talk about, the pilots who don't fall foul of this are the old pilots, the ex-Vietnam pilots, the Sullys of the world. If Sully had have listened to what his automation was telling him, he wouldn't have landed safely on the Hudson.
Right.
He'd have crashed and killed everyone on board. But I think today, and we see it, just think of it every day. When I was a kid, I remember used to going out with a family. We'd plan the trip. We had these big AA, Automobile Association atlases in the car, road maps, and it'd be great to sit through. And I used to learn so much. And then we had the TomTom navigation that came in. So people stopped using navigation. And now we have your iPhone, your Google Maps or whatever.
Right.
Turn that off. People become lost. They're not able to navigate just north. I mean, even America, the north, south, east, west grid system is so easy. People lose their minds when their phones go off and they can't have a signal. Give them a map, they wouldn't know which way to turn it up. And if you start to see that in the automation world, the over-reliance on that, how many Teslas have crashed with idiots setting autopilot and thinking the car is now able to drive itself safely? And then there's a fatal accident, which we saw with the Tesla S. And I think it's this laziness that we've moved into of relying on this. And even when all your instruments are telling you everything's fine and something tells you it's wrong, you go with the automation. Whether it's telling you false or truth, it doesn't matter. You end up making the wrong decision because you don't have those cognitive skills, because you're not thinking, you're allowing something else to be outsourced to do the thinking for you.
You're outsourcing your thinking, in this case, to a machine.
Yeah, to your car.
Thank you for tuning in to The Thinking Leader. Check the show notes for more information about the topics covered in this episode. There, you'll also find a link to our free assessment. Click on it right now to find out if you are a red team thinker with a red team culture.